Hi, everyone. Thank you all for hosting me. And I'm also joined by my grandfather, Bob Croker, or Robert Croker, who grew up in Port Melbourne and Albert Park and lives in Docklands. And I'm very happy and also a little bit more nervous to be presenting to you all with him joining us tonight. And I also have my partner, Stephanie Schwager, joining us too. I guess I'd just like to start by thanking you all. Exactly as David said, I am getting a once in a lifetime opportunity, cliched as that is, to study at Oxford University, which I'm going to talk about in a second, because of the efforts that all of you have made in doing your fundraising. Stephanie and I went to, before the lockdown, we went to the farmers market in Gasworks, and we saw your stall for fundraising, and we will return to the market and we'll buy some books. But yes, thank you. So I'm just going to try to share my screen, and I'm going to hope that it's going to work. Oh, hang on a second. Sorry, I need to let the privacy here access it. There we go. Okay. I should have done this before I started. It's saying that I need to quit and reopen it. I don't know if you could just, David, talk for 2 or 3 minutes while I just log out and log back in. Obviously, my privacy settings are very strict, and that's because I'm a human rights lawyer, which I'll talk about in a second. The digital privacy is very important. But sorry, I'll just log back in 1 moment.
While that's happening, has anybody got any questions they'd like to ask?
Oh, I'd like John to come down to the Bay Street bookstall. I've got hundreds of books for him there.
I might just let everyone know that nowadays I'm working at the Geelong Community Foundation, and we have a corpus-based model where we put out about $1 million a year of grants in the greater Geelong area, based on what David was describing about that corpus part of what Rotary does. So in the last 12 months, that's grown from about 26 million to about 30 million. And it's it proved to be pretty robust in terms of surviving the last couple of years, and being in a position where a combination of the growth of the fund and a good year of donations last year, where we actually doubled the donations that came in from about $500,000 to $1 million of donations. So yeah, just let everyone know about me being involved in a foundation that's got some similarities to the Rotary Foundation. How's that for short time until John got back?
It's perfect. I'm back.
All right.
Before you start, John, a quickie for Tony.
Yes.
The Ryman place you're working on, has that got anything to do with that, or is that purely commercial?
No, that's separate. That's my Friday gig.
Okay.
Where I'll quickly just let you guys know, every Friday I spend a bit of time on Ryman healthcare construction sites, providing mental health support and mentoring to the tradies and the blue collar guys.
Okay, I'll keep going. Can everybody see the slides here now that I've fixed that? Okay, so as David said, I'm one of 2 of the Global Grant Scholarship recipients this year. I'd also like to, start by acknowledging that I am also on the lands of the Boonwurrung people, and to pay respects to elders past, present and emerging, and any Aboriginal people who are joining us this evening. I thought I'd only spend a little bit of time going through some slides and then open it up to discussion with all of you. So I'm just going to introduce myself and sort of set the scene as to what my education and career journey has been to date. And then I'm going to talk about the research that I'm looking to undertake, all things going better than they currently are with travel and COVID and being able to go and move to England. And then I'm going to briefly touch on how my proposed research links to the peace and conflict resolution objective. So for me to have been successfully chosen as one of the scholarship recipients, I had to show how my proposed research would contribute to the reduction of conflict and the strengthening of peace in some way, which I'll talk to you about. So to introduce myself first, so I said just before, I am a human rights lawyer and I currently work at Victoria Police. So my main job is to give legal advice and also training to staff that work across Victoria Police about what their obligations are under a law called the Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities Act. And I've had that job for about 2.5 years. I should say though, before I get into that, you can see there's this photo here with my studies. So I did my undergraduate studies in Canberra at the Australian National University. And one of the 2 degrees I studied there was a law degree. This is actually a photograph, you can see there's me there, of a group of students, which included my partner, Stephanie, who also studied at ANU. And this is our lecturer, who's a professor called Simon Rice. And we're actually standing here outside of a prison. And that prison is called the Alexander McConaughey Centre. It was commissioned by the Stanhope government and it was opened in 2009. It purports to be the first human rights compliant prison in Australia. I'm sure that's a claim that would be widely contested by anybody who is incarcerated in that prison. But basically this project that we were part of as law students was to go into the prison and to talk with prisoners about different legal issues, including human rights. And it was the first opportunity that I had to really understand the importance of human rights for all of us. And also the realization that there wasn't a huge separation between me as a young person, as a young 20-something-year-old, and the people that were incarcerated there. So that was my sort of initial interest in human rights and how they apply for all of us. After that time, I graduated and then I was admitted as a lawyer. And this middle photo here is me with my mum. So my mum's also a lawyer. She's a migration lawyer or a refugee lawyer. And she moved my admission. And so I started work as a lawyer. My first job as a lawyer was working with the Australian Federal Police in Canberra. And that was quite interesting, but it wasn't just focused on human rights. But then I moved to Victoria to work in jobs that were just focused on human rights. And this is where I get to now. So this is actually a photograph that was taken in 2019 in Queensland, in the Queensland Police Service headquarters. So that's obviously me. And this is someone called Assistant Commissioner Sharon Cowden. And this is one of my colleagues, Inspector Kath Wedgwood from Victoria Police. And Assistant Commissioner Cowden is from Queensland Police, and she's responsible for Ethical Standards Command up there. So this was me going with Inspector Wedgwood to teach Queensland Police about human rights because they had just introduced a Human Rights Act in 2019. So that's an overview of where I've been to date. So what are human rights? I'm sure all of you know intrinsically, and also no doubt you've come across the concept many times before. And it's obviously a core area of focus for Rotary internationally as well, particularly with the strong connection that Rotary has had with the United Nations and shaping international human rights law. But this slide that I've got here, you'll see there's two pretty graphic images. There's one graphic image and there's another image I'll talk about in a second. This first image is was made by an Australian soldier, and his name was Jack Croker, and he was imprisoned or enslaved by Imperial Japanese forces on the Thai-Burma Railway. This is a depiction of Australian soldiers in that context, and you can see pretty graphically what happens when people's human rights are not protected as they should be, particularly rights around sanitation, healthcare, shelter, protection from torture and cruel, inhuman, degrading treatment. So international human rights law stems from the atrocities that were committed during World War II. And after World War II finished, the nations around the world formed the United Nations, as everyone knows. And one of the first things the United Nations did was it passed something called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. This is an image, I'm sure many people will recognize this person. It's Eleanor Roosevelt. And Eleanor Roosevelt, of course, was the wife of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And Eleanor Roosevelt is impressive in her own right. She was the delegate from the United States and one of 9 delegates to draft and successfully negotiate the passage of that Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And that is really the seminal document in the international human rights law canon. So that's international human rights law. And what my research is with Oxford, I'm going to be undertaking a PhD at Oxford, and it's going to be looking at how international law should regulate and govern the use of emerging technologies. And it's specifically looking at something called artificial intelligence. And you'll see here I've got the dictionary definition of artificial intelligence, and it's basically where computers can perform tasks that would normally require human intelligence. And one of the things in this definition here you'll see is where computers can be used for decision-making purposes. And of course, as a human rights lawyer working in government, my whole focus is about decisions that are made by government and how they impact on people. I've got here a couple of examples, and I've chosen bad examples where artificial intelligence has been used by government. There's lots of good examples too, but maybe they're less interesting for all of us this evening. The first one I've got up here, this is, of course, of a person dressed as a robot. And that person, I don't know if people recognize this person, is called Andrew Wilkie. He's an independent politician from Hobart, or from Tasmania. But this is a protest relating to something called robo-debt. I'm sure everyone's heard of robo-debt in the media. That was basically where Centrelink used artificial intelligence, or what's called an algorithm, to identify around 400,000 people that the algorithm said had unexplained money. And so the government said to those 400,000 people, you owe a debt. And that involved a very long court case that was resolved about 6 weeks ago, where the federal court said that whole program was a massive failure of public administration in Australia. And basically it led to a very large settlement financial payment by the Commonwealth Government because of what happened. I've got then a photo of my colleagues from New South Wales Police. In New South Wales, they have a program called the Suspect Targeting Management Plan. And New South Wales have used that to try and identify people who will commit a criminal offence in the future. If anyone's ever seen the movie Minority Report, I think it's Minority Report, where police arrest people and for doing things before they've happened. So this is actually what police are interested in doing. They want to use computer programs to say, John, you're going to commit a crime, so we're going to follow you and talk to you and blah, 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 blah. This was reviewed by the oversight body for New South Wales Police, which is called the Law Enforcement Conduct Commission. And that found of the children who were targeted by New South Wales Police, 78% were Aboriginal. So it was very discriminatory because, of course, that doesn't reflect the proportion of children across New South Wales. It's a vast overrepresentation. The last example that I've got here, this is a photo of some people standing outside one of the courts in London. I'm going to try and show you all a video, and I'm just going to hope.
Let's talk about compensation. But all I want is my money back, the money I worked for. It's been a long time, very long time, 16 years for me. We've been through a lot. People have walked away from this who were responsible for this and have gone with, you know, pockets full of money. You know, there should be, I'd like to sit down with them and ask them a question, why? That's the biggest word I can use, is why. All I want is the money I worked for. That's what I would like back, because I lost everything. I nearly lost my house. I had to sell it cheaply, or I'd have lost it completely. I lost my private pensions. I lost my wages. I lost my, well, I lost everything. And as I said, if I get the money that I'd worked for back, I'll be very, very happy.
So let me just explain what this is. I think you probably got some of the text from the slides, possibly. I'm sorry if that was breaking up a little bit, but basically what happened is in the UK, they have post offices, as we do, and local post offices, you know, you go there for your banking and you go there obviously to post things. So the post office in the UK got a new computer system, and that computer system was faulty. And it said that all of these sub postmasters, who are small business owners basically, had very significant amounts of money that was unaccounted for. And the police then prosecuted those people, and many of them went to jail, and they hadn't actually done anything. So the person that I just tried to show you a video of was a sub postmaster from Wales who was sent to prison for 7 months. Of what he was saying, he lost everything. He lost his house. He obviously lost his reputation, and so on. So that was really full on injustice. And I guess this is really what I want to research in terms of human rights and how governments use computer programs, because there's lots of opportunities for government decision making to be much more efficient and professional and transparent. but there's also a lot of risk. And because of the scale on which computer programs can be used in government decision making, if there's problems with them, then the scale of the injustice is also magnified. I realize I've taken probably much too long, but I'm particularly focused on police, which I can talk about in a second in terms of how police will use artificial intelligence. And then, of course, the university that I'll be studying at is Oxford University, which has a lot of world-leading research around emerging technologies and human rights. And I wanted just to close with a discussion around the peace and conflict resolution research theme. So I think, or my assumption is that when you think about peace and conflict resolution, you'll probably think about faraway places, like currently maybe Myanmar or somewhere else. And often that's the same with human rights. People will think about faraway places. There's a really famous quote from Eleanor Roosevelt that talks about the importance of human rights in places close to home, because human rights is all about us as humans and people. And so the way that I'm thinking about peace and conflict resolution really goes to the trust and confidence that we all have in our governments. And if our governments use these technologies and their use of these technologies harm us, then that's going to create further distrust of us in the institutions of government and in our democracy. And in turn, that could create conflict. So really, I'm trying with this research to avoid that outcome and actually to strengthen the representation that governments have for all of us in the work that they do. Again, I want to thank you all for the work that you have done on your fundraising, which is allowing me to undertake this opportunity. And I'd also like you to keep in touch. I've got my email addresses here, and I'll give my details again to you, David, so you can share them with everybody. But it would really be great to keep in touch with you all. My studies are going to take at least 3 years. Hopefully within a 3-year period, some of you might be able to visit overseas. And if you do come to Oxford, I'd be very happy to host you all, I'm sure. But otherwise, thank you very much.
All right. Well, just on the, I'll go with the first question, so to speak, John. Probably it's more a comment than a question, but obviously anybody who's got a question, if you know how to use your button there to put a hand up, we'll see if we can take you in order. But I would just say, yes, while we might think of peace and conflict as being things like war in far off places, and that we're relatively peaceful here, we do have some issues right at home, and we had one on Saturday. Demonstrations against lockdown.
Oh yes, indeed.
Now,
yes,
I mean,
indeed.
We're starting right from there. It's like, you know, there are issues on our doorstep.
That's very true. That's very true. And you can, and I mean, it's a perfect example, even with my current job, giving advice to the police about rights that protect peaceful protests. So under our law, there are a number of rights that protect peaceful process, including freedom of thought, conscience, religion, and belief, freedom of expression, and freedom of peaceful assembly. The human rights are not absolute, and that's part of the way that police need to engage with it. Yes, protesters have a right to do things peacefully, but that needs to be balanced against, in this case, the risk to public health. But then, of course, there are also limits in what police can do in responding to a protest. So it's obviously disproportionate for police to use lethal force to disperse a crowd. But really, I think the interesting thing for a human rights lawyer working for the police is how do you navigate through the grey, where it's not the black and white? Because really, human rights law is all about ethics and decision making. But yeah, that's a great example, David.
Despite our differences of opinion, we can all have a difference of opinion.
Yes,
Anyway,
that's right. Yep.
Richard's got a question.
Okay. In America, they have a Bill of Rights. We don't have a Bill of Rights here, I believe.
That's right.
Are we signatories to the UN Human Rights Declaration? I think it's the right word.
Yes.
We are.
Yes, we are. Yes. So there is a couple of what are called covenants or treaties. So there is a international covenant on civil and political rights and an international covenant on economic, social and cultural rights. So Australia is a signatory of those and was one of the drafters of those. But you're right, we haven't passed a Commonwealth law to give it legal effect like the Americans have with the Bill of Rights in their constitution. The Canadians have a Charter of Rights, which is in their constitution. The New Zealanders have a New Zealand Bill of Rights Act. And in the UK, they have their Human Rights Act from 1998. So Australia is the only OECD country that doesn't have a national Human Rights Act. But then at the state and territory level, there are 3 places that have human rights laws. So obviously Victoria is one. This often is what I do with the police when I'm giving them human rights training. I'll talk about this, and it's sort of my trivia question. I'll then say, what are the other jurisdictions that have a Human Rights Act? And usually people will just start guessing places. One of them is the Australian Capital Territory, and the other, as you all know from that photograph that I showed before, is Queensland. But it's a bit of a litmus test for me to see how parochial my colleagues are, because they always choose Queensland last. We do not think that Queensland is a place where human rights are protected as Victorians. But yes, they're the 3 jurisdictions.
Sorry, if I can just go on further. The fact we've signed the UN Treaty of Rights means absolutely squat then.
I think in some ways that's true, like domestically. So for you as a Victorian, if you have had a very bad interaction with Victoria Police, then you can sue Victoria Police, and Victoria Police will be held to account for that international standard. But if you were in New South Wales and the same thing happened in New South Wales, then you couldn't. And if you had an issue with the Commonwealth, then you couldn't. So that example I gave before about robo-debt, the people that were impacted by that, they can't say this is a breach of my human rights because there's no Commonwealth human rights law. Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions? No. John, I want to ask one. I had my professional career basically run pretty much from the start of computers back in the late 70s, early 80s, before they took off. And as most people know, I'm an accountant, but in auditing, the thing that came up was, hey, I mean, initially, very early on, hey, nobody knows what that computer is actually doing. So a whole new field started of, you know, forensic accounting and forensic technology of getting in and being able to read a computer program from an audit perspective. And one of the famous early cases was a programmer in a bank in America who programmed the calculation of interest to 12 decimal places and hived off the last 10 decimal places to his own bank account. Now, one of the things that I've always carried with me is that whenever anybody says the computer made a mistake, there was a computer glitch, I simply say, no, it didn't. A human made a mistake to make the computer do the wrong thing. And one of the things we have a problem with is accountability for that. Now, I think that's the problem with that UK one. Where was the accountability for the people who made a stuffed up computer program that ended up reporting that these people had cash shortfalls?
Yeah, that's exactly right. that's exactly right. And I think the really exciting and scary development with computing, and I don't purport to be someone that has any particular expertise in this, but there's a technology called neural networks, which obviously is around humans and thinking. And we are getting to computers that are so powerful to get to a point that we can't understand how they work, David. So you're exactly right. Like currently, we will design a program, and if the program has made a mistake, well, we can track back and see, oh, yep, there's the mistake that was made. And so that's part of the risk. So for example, that New South Wales police example, the reason they're getting those poorer results is because the data that it's relying on has racial bias in it. And so that's why it's going to replicate that. But then we have another stream, which is where the computer can get to such a level of complexity that we can't even understand how it's made a decision. So from a government accountability perspective, how do we bring that transparency and accountability if we don't even understand how it's worked? Yes. Matt, I think Matthew had a question too.
Yeah, this is a bit of a loaded one. I'm curious as to how you think law enforcement and government agencies are handling that rapid change in technology and the capabilities that are being presented to them. To put it in context, and just to explain why I'm asking, so one of my companies provides interpreting and translation services to a number of agencies, including law enforcement. As part of that service, we provide transcriptions of interviews, for example, as an example, purely hypothetical. And that will include the text being spoken by the English speaker and the non-English speaking person, and possibly other agency members. The technology that we have right now allows us to obviously provide the interpreting translation, but also what's called sentiment analysis based on neural nets that you're talking about. So we can say, we can provide data that reflects, is the person happy or sad when they're talking? Are they nervous? Are they different behavioral contexts? That's getting to a point that the technology now from the large neural net vendors are saying, well, we can now tell whether a speaker is actually lying or not. How do you trust that information? We have that data, and our clients are saying to us, can we have that data? And we're saying, well, isn't that impeding the rights of the person being interviewed?
Yeah, that's right.
How do you cope with that situation?
Well, I mean, it's a great example and of the issue that, I'm really wanting to drill down to in terms of the importance of human rights and regulation of these emerging technologies with human rights. And really, I think the risk for people in government, going back to what you were saying before, David, about, I don't understand, the computer just told me, the computer said no, and so that's why I say no, is if the police officer, the investigator, doesn't understand whether the person, their behavior is indicating guilt or otherwise, but that program says Matthew is acting guiltily, Matthew is lying. When he said whatever he said, he is lying. And how does the police officer who's exercising the powers, how does the police officer interrogate that? And if the police officer can't, then should that technology be allowed for police officers to use? So another example is what's called live facial recognition. And that's as it sounds. So a camera will see the biometrics on my face, which means the measurement between my eyes and the place of my nose and my forehead and everything else. And then it can say, okay, this is a photo that matches this photo. So it might be the police database that says John is, a criminal, matches. So police, obviously, they would really like to use that technology. And lots of police services do, because they will have outstanding warrants. And if they've got a camera that's driving around and then it says, oh, look, John's over there, go and grab him. Well, sure, that sounds great. But then the technology in the UK, they used this, the Metropolitan Police, and it had a 98% failure rate. So that means that 98% of the time, police arrested somebody because the technology said that person has an outstanding warrant, and they didn't have an outstanding warrant. And this was in 2018. So the failure rate from a human rights perspective is far too high, because it's then leading to police using their powers to arrest people where they otherwise wouldn't have done that. If the camera wasn't there, computer wasn't there, then the person may have recognized the person that has the outstanding warrant. Okay, that's why I've arrested them. But otherwise, there's no grounds for arrest. Yeah, it's really significant.
Ian, I think.
Okay, thanks, David. I guess two questions. Firstly, you know, if they were looking at the data from the camera, it's obvious then that what the problem is. They weren't using Huawei and Chinese cameras, because then they would have been far more accurate. So that's
yes, indeed.
That's number one.
That's right.
That's it. And
how do the Chinese recognize anybody? They all look the same, don't they?
Well,
not anymore.
This is the interesting thing too with that technology. You know, the most sophisticated artificial intelligence, particularly, well, in all sorts of ways, is being developed in China, where there obviously aren't any human rights protections. And so that also presents a challenge for an Australian government or a democratic government to then say, well, will we buy this tool that's really accurate because it's been used in this way when it's been used in an authoritarian country? But yes, go on, Ian.
Yeah, no, that's right. So just and I'll say this a little bit flippantly, but surely there should be something in human rights, basic human rights, where, now this is going to sound a little bit of a stretch, you pay taxes to a government that we have elected, and the people make mistake after mistake after mistake, and there's no liability. So the question that I have is, as you go through your PhD, why don't you see if you can pin some liability onto our politicians to actually spend our tax money wisely?
So that's a huge challenge, and it's difficult for me as a bureaucrat to talk about accountability and personal liability.
Good luck on that one.
Important point. It's an important point. But also it goes, you know, even in all seriousness, the bond, or however you want to describe it, in a democracy between government and the people is not a certain, it's not a given. So yeah, I think that's a great important point. In this democracy, power can only be exercised where it's given. And if it's not that the community can easily take power from institutions, but they can certainly protest and they can revolt, and that we can have conflict and all sorts of things.
I just asked, when you finish your PhD, I actually find this fascinating. When you finish your PhD, you're going to find something novel, because otherwise you won't get your PhD. It would be really interesting for you to come back via Zoom and actually tell us what these specific things that you have discovered or calculated that is novel. Would be very interesting to hear that back from you. In your words.
I'm very happy to do it. I'm even happy to do it to give you updates. Like, you don't have to wait 3 years. I'm happy to meet once a year to present how things are going and to show you around Oxford through Zoom. Yeah.
There you go, guys. We know it. There you are.
Another thing there, Ian, though, just one of the rules that go with these scholarships is that there's actually a 5-year rule that says stay in touch for at least 5 years. He's got to submit reports to Rotary, and I'm his coordinator for the district. So I think John and I are going to have a relationship going on for quite some time.
Yes,
That's
yes,
that's
yes.
great. That's great. But
Oh
where I'm
yeah,
coming
and
from,
trying to bring it out to the club as well, or
Yeah,
and other clubs for that
yeah.
matter.
I'm really interested. I think it's a fascinating area, and you know, I just love to try and find out and learn from what you've actually discovered.
Yes,
Well,
for sure. I should also say too, the thing I'm really excited about is the supervisor of my PhD is a man from Finland called Martin Scheinen, and he has very extensive experience working for the United Nations. So he was what's called a special rapporteur, which is like a sort of expert that shapes international human rights law. And he is looking at how we can shape international human rights law with these emerging technologies. So that's the thing I'm really excited about. It's not just a theoretical exercise, but it actually, for me as a practitioner, working with someone like that to try and shape the future of what the law looks like. Yeah.
I think there are several countries who are interested in that, John.
And several that
Yes.
aren't.
Well, but you know,
And far too many that aren't, unfortunately. Yes.
well, but I know there are all those ones who
That's
want to
awesome.
somehow or other curb the power and influence of Facebook, Google.
Yes, that's
you know,
true.
and
That's
the way
true.
that they have advanced beyond
Immense power.
any legislative controls. And
Yes,
yeah,
that's
so
true.
You know where, David, you know where their servers are based?
all over the place.
No, but specifically, where the best place is that they put their servers?
Not off the top of my head.
In Seattle,
Mm.
because it is so difficult legally to get access to a database that's in Seattle. That's where they house them all. So you'll find the core of it, all of the high-tech companies, all going to be in Seattle. So you want to try to sue them, boy, do they make it difficult.
Yeah, but they've got to have servers all over the place in case one goes. That they can switch from one to another if anything happens.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, they can't rely on one.
No.
All right. Now I take it Ian and Matthew probably have had their questions. You haven't got more questions, have you, Matthew? No, you still got your hand up. That's all.
Oh, sorry.
We're trying to work out how to lower it. Good.
All right. Well, thank you, John. I think we better think about wrapping things up now at 7:45. Thank you for that presentation. I find it fascinating, and I think everybody now can see the reason why we chose John as a global grant scholar, because we think this is something that is probably, call it earth-shattering, getting right out there into the cutting edge of what's going on in the world, and hopefully controlling the power of some people who are presumably going to abuse power in the future if they haven't already. So thank you very much. I'd like everybody to thank John.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everybody. Really appreciate it.
We usually present a book of some sort to our guest speakers from our recycled book program, John. So Carol, when John turns up at the Gasworks or
yes, at the Pipeworks,
or her stall in Bay Street, if you happen
I'll
to be
come
there,
by and say
give
hi.
John have a book chosen ready to give him as his guest speaker present, please.
Thank you.
So thank you very much, John.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone.